The video game industry has been around since the days of Magnavox and Pong machines. But the industry as we know it today, the massive and ever-evolving market of the present, led by the three juggernauts we've grown fond and familiar with, Sony, Nintendo, and Microsoft, truly began in the 1980s. Of course, I'm referring to the notorious story of Atari's oversaturation of the home console market in the 70s that reached its breaking point at the holiday release of E.T. in 1983, ultimately and abruptly ending both the second generation of consoles and the golden age of arcade games. This recession lasted for 2 years, between 1983 and 85, only revived by a new challenger to the console market who knew just the right approach to persuade consumers to put their dollars towards the video game industry once again and more than ever: Nintendo. Yes, Nintendo would localize their 1983 console, the family computer better known as the Famicom, introducing it to the West as the Nintendo Entertainment System, aka the NES. With genius strategy, selling the system as a high-tech toy rather than another home console, and revolutionary games that would jumpstart iconic properties like Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda, Nintendo and their NES would swiftly become the savior of the video game industry and usher in a new era of innovation and excitement in the gaming sphere. Now, knowing this, it would be an understatement to say that Nintendo is critical to the industry that we know today, and to even suggest that video game consoles today could be completely different if not for the NES would be a fair judgment as well. But in an ironic twist of fate, it would be the same Nintendo who would also make arguably the greatest mistake of the modern age. A fumbled opportunity that would lead to a testy relationship, an embarrassing attempt to rebound from said opportunity, and a butterfly effect that would subsequently shape both the highs and the lows of the company that followed and the landscape of the video game industry for the 30 years that followed as well. I'm referring to none other than the Super Nintendo Entertainment System CD-ROM, better known in legend as the Nintendo PlayStation. Let's talk about it. Before Sony's hostile takeover of the gaming industry, they were close observers of the blossoming of video games in the 1980s. Besides supplying parts, Sony was busy making strides in their own lane. After seeing Nintendo's tremendous ascension, figures within the company, such as Japanese engineering technologist Ken Kutaragi, became immensely intrigued with the prospect of having a more hands-on involvement with developing video game systems with the latest generations of consoles on the horizon. Kutaragi's interest sparked from watching his own daughter's infatuation with her Famicom, and when the opportunity arose, he would take on a contract at Sony for the development of hardware that would drive the audio subsystem of Nintendo's upcoming console, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. During this period, Kutaragi would covertly develop the Sony SPC 700 without Sony's knowledge. At the time, Sony themselves were still mostly uninterested in the prospect of entering the video game business. With Kutaragi's project near completion, many of the higher-ups at Sony disapproved of it. Determined, he would eventually find support from Sony executive Norio Oga, who would grant Ken the approval to finish the project. Ultimately, the SPC 700 chip was a large success for the Super NES, and satisfied by this, Nintendo didn't hesitate to enter a partnership with Sony to help achieve a goal Nintendo had grown increasingly interested in: the CD-ROM format. Sony would benefit from this alliance as well, as they sought clearance and assistance from Nintendo to conjure a Sony system that was capable of playing both SNES cartridges and the new Super Disc format. The deal would actually give way to an uncharacteristic clause that would hand off a large amount of Nintendo hardware and licensing over to Sony. Sony would also be the sole benefactor of licensing related to music and movie software that it had been pursuing as a secondary application. However, the issue with this was that Sony was already the sole manufacturer of the SNES's audio chip, which would force developers to pay for pricey Sony development tools just to work with the Super NES. Noticing this, Nintendo President Hiroshi Yamauchi was extremely wary and feared that Sony was taking advantage of his company for greed. In fact, Yamauchi even believed that he found a beneficial partner in the Dutch company Philips, one of Sony's largest competitors. Philips was willing to allow Nintendo to retain control of their software. Foreseeing this favorable scenario in comparison to Sony's contract, Yamauchi would send Nintendo of America President Minoru Arakawa and Howard Lincoln to negotiate with Philips behind Sony's back. They would ultimately come to an agreement, and the two sides would continue developing this fabled Super NES going into the 90s. The sticky situation took an abrupt shift in tone at the 1991 Consumer Electronics Show, where Sony proudly revealed their Super Nintendo compatible dual cartridge and CD system that they had called the PlayStation. Except the following day at the show, Nintendo would come out and announce their partnership with Philips, to the dismay of Sony. Ken Kutaragi had actually learned of this betrayal 2 days prior to the show and tried to reach out to numerous contacts, even Philips, to no avail. Following this public backhand at CES 1991, Sony and Nintendo would still make attempts to find a middle ground, and upwards of 300 prototypes of the PlayStation would be constructed, with software being in development as well. Sony, still disgruntled from Nintendo breaking the unwritten rule, had even reached out to Nintendo's prominent rival at the time, Sega, to produce a CD-ROM based machine dubbed the Sega Multimedia Entertainment System, or the SMES. However, their board of directors in Tokyo vetoed the idea when American CEO Tom Kalinske presented them the concept. In another dismissal of Sony that would be of terrible hindsight, the board laughed at the idea, stating that Sony didn't know how to make video game hardware, let alone software. The following year, the two companies would even come to a new deal that Nintendo could soundly agree to, where Sony could produce SNES hardware that Nintendo still retained the rights and profits of. Despite all of these efforts from both sides, Sony never recovered from the perceived backstabbing from Nintendo, and by May 4th, 1992, they had officially canned any further work on the ambitious SNES CD system. But Sony wouldn't let all of the work and concepts they had go to waste, and although the Super NES CD-ROM was dead, the PlayStation was still very, very alive. A meeting was held in June of 1992 to decide on the fate of what was left of the PlayStation project, where Kutaragi revealed a CD-ROM based system capable of 3D graphics. Norio Oga, still one of Kutaragi's largest backers, was excited by the promise of the system. Higher ups still opposed to it, as they still had written off the hardware industry as overblown toy manufacturers, a lingering perspective from Nintendo's marketing angle that saved the industry a decade prior. However, with Nintendo's betrayal and disrespect still fresh in both Kutaragi and Oga's minds, there was no budging them from the vision of the PlayStation. On October 27, 1993, Sony would announce their entrance into the console market with the Sony PlayStation. Despite Kutaragi's confidence that his technology and the 3D graphics the system would be capable of would surpass anything on the market, there was still uncertainty on if the PlayStation should focus on 2D games like the established Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis consoles instead. Be that as it may, Sega would inadvertently guide Sony in the right direction, as the success of their Virtua Fighter arcade cabinets convinced Sony to commit to the industry-pushing 3D graphics at just the right time, and a little over a year later, the Sony PlayStation would launch on December 4th, 1994, beating out Nintendo to the first to enter the fifth generation of home console markets, and the industry would never, ever be the same. Sony's subsequent announcement and entrance into the industry would send competitors into a scramble. Sega's fifth-generation effort, the Sega Saturn, would have a hurried Western release just in an attempt to get a head start on the PlayStation following a sizzling scene at E3 1995, where Sega would reveal the $399 price point of the Saturn, just to immediately get one-upped by Sony when Steve Race, the head of development, went up on stage and said $299, leaving the audience in applause.
I'm going to ask Sony Computer Entertainment President of America, Steve Race, to join me for a brief presentation. $299.
Sony's arrival had punched the industry in the mouth and forced Nintendo to push to enter 3D sooner than they were prepared for as well, with their next console, the Nintendo 64, going into its own development hell before finally surfacing in late 1996. But as we know, it was all a little too late, and the PlayStation would go on to win the 5th generation in staggering fashion. The console would outperform and outsell its two major competitors, as the PlayStation would sell a mind-boggling 102 million units compared to the N64's 33 million and the Saturn's 9. Sony would swiftly establish themselves on the market with an offering that could easily stand and compete with both Nintendo and Sega, who had been rooted in video games for nearly 2 decades by the mid-90s. As for Nintendo's decision, the end result can be found on the Philips Compact Disc Interactive, better known as the CDI. Nintendo and Philips were never able to achieve the dual format system that Sony had envisioned for their own project, but Nintendo would technically be successful in venturing their properties out to the CD-ROM format. With that being said, I would use the word successful very sparingly.
Gee, it sure is boring around here.
My boy, this piece is what all true warriors strive for.
I just wonder what Ganon's up to.
In October of 1994, Philips claimed an install base of 1 million units for the CDI worldwide. 2 years later, the Wall Street Journal reported that the total US sales amounted to only 400,000 units, so yeah. Sega would stumble to the end of the decade and collapse to the point where they made the decision to leave the hardware market altogether by 2001, a story that will have a video of its own very soon. Nintendo would slowly lose the market and grow a disconnect with the consumers, struggling to mount strong enough commercial success with both the Nintendo 64 and their first venture into the disc format with the GameCube. It took their own revolution with the Wii to regain their old glory in terms of market dominance for a new generation, before failing once again with the Wii U. Now, in the Switch era, it seems the company is growing out of some of their old habits and have found their lane in the industry to comfortably compete with Sony and Microsoft without too much disparity. And oh yeah, Microsoft would see how Sony bombarded the market as a multimedia company with the PlayStation and would go on to threaten desktop computers and home entertainment, which Microsoft saw as a direct jab. Seeing this, Microsoft would join the fray in 2001 with the Xbox. The Xbox would strike a chord with a seemingly untapped market of gamers and branch into its own successful line of gaming hardware. As for Sony, well, obviously taking the bet on themselves after Nintendo's slight would become a business-shifting decision. The sequel would be even greater, as the PlayStation 2 would act as the seismic toss of the industry that summoned Microsoft, buried Sega, and kicked Nintendo to the bottom of the podium. With the PS2 becoming the best-selling console of all time, selling well over 155 million units worldwide, it had become crystal clear that Nintendo might have made a massive mistake to allow Sony to build this gaming empire that now has been over 25 years at the forefront of the industry. Sony would go on to encroach upon Nintendo's beloved handheld market with the PSP and the PS Vita, outsell Nintendo twice out of the next 3 generations following the PS1, and take a portion of the market that the Big N will likely never get back. But what if Nintendo did honor Sony's project all of those years ago? The lesson that could be learned from this situation can easily be to not make poor business decisions on Nintendo's part. However, hindsight is 20/20, and no company, especially Nintendo, is perfect. The true takeaway from the Nintendo PlayStation is that everything has a history, everything has a story, and everything has a reason. Nintendo had already cemented its respect in the industry a decade prior to Sony's involvement. There are examples of similar business deal falters that held akin potential to forever shift their prospective markets over the history of industry. But with that in mind, this fascinating and contextual story is ultimately nothing more than gaming's largest what if. What if the Nintendo PlayStation released? Would Nintendo hold supreme dominance of the console market for years to come? Would Sony even ever explore the idea of branching off into their own consoles? Would Sega have the room to continue developing hardware going into the 2000s as Nintendo's sole competitor? Would Microsoft still want to enter the market? Would we still get innovative, era-defining systems like the Wii and the Switch? Would beloved franchises with early synonymity with Sony like God of War, Crash Bandicoot, Uncharted, Gran Turismo, and Ratchet & Clank have ever surfaced under Nintendo's publication? What do you think? Be sure to let me know down in the comments below. If you made it to the end of the video, I truly appreciate you. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and to subscribe to the channel. And as always, take care, good game, and thank you so much for watching. Peace.